Hey everyone, and welcome. Today we are going way back to ancient Greece to explore the mind of a thinker who came up with ideas so powerful, so ahead of their time, they basically built the foundation for modern science. Let's get into the incredible world of Democritus.
All right, let's just kick things off with, the biggest question of all. What is everything really made of? You, me, this screen, the stars, what's the fundamental stuff? Well, over 2,000 years ago, Democritus gave an answer that's, it's both ridiculously simple and deeply weird.
And this quote right here, this is the key that unlocks his entire way of thinking. What he's saying is that the world we actually experience, the sweetness of a cookie, the bitterness of coffee, that's kind of like a user interface, not the actual operating system. In reality, underneath it all, there are only two things: atoms and the empty space they exist in.
That's it. Seriously, that's the entire recipe for reality according to Democritus. It's not earth, wind, fire, and water, no divine spirits pulling the strings. It all boils down to just two fundamental things. So let's break down what he actually meant by that.
The name itself tells you pretty much the whole story. Atomos in Greek literally means uncuttable. Democritus had this brilliant thought experiment. He figured if you take something and just keep cutting it in half over and over again, you have to eventually get to a point where you've got this tiny fundamental particle that just can't be cut any further. And that's what he called the atom.
So, here are our two main characters. Think of the atoms as this infinite box of cosmic Lego bricks. They're solid, they've been around forever, they never get destroyed, and they come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. And the void? Well, the void is just the empty space, the cosmic playroom that lets all these Lego bricks move around, bump into each other, connect, and break apart. You see, without that empty space, everything would just be one giant, solid, motionless block.
And this is where you really see how radical his idea was for the time. This was a world filled with gods and magic and spirits, and here comes Democritus saying, nope, a thunderstorm isn't Zeus being angry, it's just a certain arrangement of atoms clashing in the void. Everything, and I mean everything, has a purely physical cause and effect.
Okay, but wait a second. This brings up a massive problem, right? If the real world is just a bunch of colorless, tasteless, silent atoms bouncing around in empty space, then where does all of this come from? Where does the color red come from? Or the smell of freshly cut grass?
Democritus had an absolutely brilliant answer for this, one that philosophers are still arguing about. He said that atoms have real properties. We call them primary qualities, like their shape and their size. But things like color, taste, and smell, those aren't actually in the objects themselves. They are secondary qualities. They are effects that get produced inside us when those atoms interact with our sense organs. So red isn't out there in the world. Red is something that happens in your head.
And he even came up with a physical mechanism for how this could work. He had this idea that objects are constantly shedding these super thin films of atoms, which he called idola. These little atom films fly through the void, they smack into our eyes or our tongue, and the particular shape and arrangement of those atoms triggers the sensation that our brain interprets as blue or salty. So get this, you're not actually seeing the apple, you're experiencing the physical impact of atoms that came from the apple. Mind-blowing, right?
Now, you might be thinking, wow, this all sounds kind of cold and meaningless. But here's the twist. Democritus wasn't some grim philosopher. In fact, his nickname was the Laughing Philosopher. He took this seemingly cold mechanical view of the universe and turned it into a foundation for a very practical, very human guide on how to live a good, happy, and cheerful life.
For Democritus, the ultimate goal wasn't just chasing fleeting moments of pleasure. It was something much deeper, a state he called euthymia. You can think of it as a kind of deep, untroubled contentment. It's a stable, inner balance and cheerfulness that isn't constantly being knocked around by the chaos of the outside world. It's about well-being. So how do we actually get there? Well, his advice flows perfectly from his physics. Look at these principles. It's all about finding moderation and balance, about seeking knowledge so you understand how the world works. It's about cutting away disturbing emotions like envy. Because hey, if the world is just atoms in the void, then endlessly chasing external things like fame or fortune is pointless. True, lasting contentment has to come from the state of the atoms inside you, from the state of your soul.
So, there you have it. This incredible, unified system of physics and ethics, all from one guy in the 4th century BCE. So what happened to these amazing ideas? Well, for a very long time, pretty much nothing. For about 2,200 years, Just let that number sink in. The philosophies of Plato and Aristotle really dominated Western thought. And Democritus's atomic theory? It was mostly forgotten, or just dismissed as this weird, godless idea that couldn't possibly be true. An idea lost to time for over 2 millennia.
But then things started to change. In the early 1800s, scientists like John Dalton began doing experiments that provided hard evidence that matter really is made of tiny, discrete units. Suddenly, the atom was back, not just as a philosophical guess, but as a scientific reality. And of course, today, all of modern physics is built on the fact that our reality is made of fundamental particles.
And that's the real takeaway here. Sure, he didn't know about protons or electrons or quarks. Of course not. But his fundamental intuition, his core idea, that the incredibly complex world we see all around us emerges from the simple interactions of fundamental particles moving in space, that idea was proven to be absolutely, profoundly right.
Which leaves us with one last huge question. It's the question Democritus's philosophy forces every single one of us to think about. If we really are just a complex, temporary arrangement of atoms, an arrangement that will one day come apart and disperse back into the void, then what does it mean to live a good life? What does it truly mean to be human? Now that is something to chew on.